Hello, my name is Nicholas Morton, and in this talk I'm going to provide a reinterpretation of the Battle of Hattin, one of the most important battles fought in the history of the Crusader States. But to begin, and to explain the battle's significance, I'm going to provide a little bit of historical background. So the Battle of Hattin took place in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem was one of the 4 Crusader states set up either during the First Crusade or in its immediate aftermath. And in their early years, in the early 12th century, the Crusader states prospered, growing economically and territorially to become leading powers in the Near East. But then, as the 12th century developed, and particularly on their eastern borders, the Crusader states faced increasing resistance from the Turkish dynasties in that area. In particular, the Zangid dynasty, begun by the Atabeg Zengi, ruler of Aleppo and Mosul, came to pose a major threat to the Crusader states, and famously in 1144, Zengi conquered the city of Edessa, an act which would lead ultimately to the collapse of the Crusader state, the county of Edessa. But the remaining 3 Crusader states continued into the mid to late 12th century and remained major powers in the area. Then, in the 60s, Zengi's son, Nur al-Din, who took over Zengi's territories in Aleppo and had later on conquered Damascus, also managed to secure control over Egypt, creating a very large empire from which he was able to exert considerable pressure on the Crusader states, as well as against his various other opponents on other frontiers. And then later on, following Nur al-Din's death in 1174, Saladin became a major power across the Near East. He had already taken control in Egypt, but then during the 1170s and early 1180s, he seized control over much of his former master Nur al-Din's territories in Syria to create a very substantial empire that would become known as the Ayyubid Empire. And as his power grew, Saladin was able to exert a great deal of pressure on his various opponents, including the Crusader states. And so many campaigns took place whereby Saladin invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem in particular, trying to look for a way to bring about the Kingdom of Jerusalem's collapse and to reconquer Jerusalem. And so by 1187, this had been going on for many years, but until this time, Saladin had not found a way to break through the defences of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and certainly the Kingdom of Jerusalem's field army was very substantial, possibly as many as 20,000 troops. Now, by 1187, Saladin's own field army probably numbered around 30,000 troops, and in this year, he staged another major invasion into the Kingdom of Jerusalem, across the kingdom's northern borders, approaching the kingdom by moving south of Lake Tiberius, and then laying siege to the town of Tiberius. Now, I've really got to stress that this campaign, even at the outset, placed considerable pressure on both the ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and on Saladin. Saladin had been promising for years that he would restore Jerusalem to Islam and score a decisive blow against the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But so far he had not succeeded, and his supporters were beginning to demand results. Why should they follow him if he wasn't leading them to victory? On the other side of the frontier, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was ruled by King Guy of Lusignan, and King Guy was also in a very difficult position. The kingdom at this time was riven by various aristocratic factions, and many did not like Guy, and so he too needed a victory, whereas a defeat could prove disastrous for him as King of Jerusalem. And so, with that in mind, let's now look at the battlefield over which the Battle of Hattin would take place. So, as I mentioned, Saladin moved south of the Sea of Galilee, and then at the start of July 1187, he laid siege to the town of Tiberius. Further west, the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army was assembled at Sephuria, which is a good location. There's a small castle there. It's well supplied with water. It's a good place to encamp an army. Saladin did approach Guy's army looking for battle, but clearly he felt that Guy's position was too heavily fortified, and so he withdrew back to continue his siege of Tiberius. So then the battle took place a few days later on the 3rd and 4th of July. And the crucial moment in this is King Guy's decision to march out and lift the siege of Tiberius. And so let's discuss that a little bit. So on the night of the 2nd and 3rd of July, King Guy met in council with his various other barons and the other leaders of the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And they were there to discuss a question that they had already been discussing, which is, should they march out on Tiberius? And the account that we have of this council suggests that the leading baron, called Raymond III of Tripoli, who's also the Count of Tripoli, as well as being one of the barons of the Kingdom of Jerusalem as well, he said to Guy, do not march out against Saladin at Tiberius. Presumably he was thinking that this is a very arid region, there's not many springs, it would be difficult to re-water an army in that territory. He may also have felt that it was too great a risk to place the Kingdom of Jerusalem's field army in a scenario where it could be substantially defeated potentially, which might then precipitate the collapse of the kingdom. And initially, Guy seemed to take Raymond III's advice, even though Raymond was very much his political opponent. And yet, so the story goes, that night, the master of the Templars, Gerard of Ridford, convinced Guy not to adopt that plan, but to march out against Saladin's army at first light. And so sure enough, the following morning, Guy assembled his forces, and then in the early morning, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem set out to relieve Tiberius. And initially, it covered a fair amount of ground very quickly. Now, the distance between Sophuriae and Tiberius is about 30 kilometres. So the road that they would have to follow. And so that resets up the conditions for the battle. Guy knows he has to reach Tiberius quickly, or the army will collapse. There's not much water in the intervening territory, and this is July in the Near East. It's hot, and of course you should imagine all these knights wearing their chainmail armour and padded jackets underneath, all mounted on horses, and so they're going to need a great deal of water, and they're also not going to be able to fight for long in the midday heat. And so at first light, Guy sets out on the 3rd of July, 1187. And his army makes very good progress, at least initially, reaching the small settlement of Turan. And there's a small spring there, so he could have re-watered his army to an extent, but there's not enough water at Turan to water the entire army. So he has to push on. Now, during this same time, Saladin has been preparing his army to give battle against that of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, Saladin's game plan at this point doesn't seem to have been to break the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, at least not at this point. His intention seems instead to have been to try and slow Guy's forces down. And so he brings a substantial contingent of his army behind the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army, and then tries to wear it down and to slow it. And Saladin's army is well set up to do this. Saladin's army at this time included a great many mounted archers, and these archers, their favoured tactic was to charge up to within 50-60 metres of an opposing army, shoot a few volleys of arrows at that army, and then wheel away before any counter-strike can be waged against them. And so that continual repetitive series of attacks by mounted archers trying to wear down the Jerusalemite army, trying to slow it down, trying to prevent it from reaching its objective. And so there's a cycle of attacks focusing on the rearguard. Now, King Guy's army at this time was arrayed in a formation that historians have dubbed a fighting march. And a fighting march is basically a box in which the outer edges of the box are composed of infantry, equipped with big shields to keep off arrows and spears in case enemy forces should try and charge their line, but also lines of archers and crossbowmen so that they can shoot back at any forces that come into range. And at the Battle of Hattin, given the sheer size of the Jerusalemite army, it seems likely that there may have been several of these boxes. John France, who's a leading historian in this field, suggests that there may have been 3. And so this is the opening of the scenario. The Jerusalemite army trying to march on Tiberius. That's its objective. It knows that it can re-water the army at Lake Tiberius, but it has to get there. Saladin trying to slow the army down with an endless cycle of attacks, sending in wave after wave of mounted archers. And initially, no one seems to have gained the upper hand, and the army eventually reached the settlement of Mascana. And you can see it marked here on the map. Now, at Mascana, there was a crucial decision point. Should King Guy try and push on for Lake Tiberius, or should the army encamp at Mascana for the night? And arguments were offered for and against those different ideas. Several people advanced the idea that the army must push on for Lake Tiberius, otherwise it would run out of water, and in the morning it would be dehydrated and therefore less capable of fighting. But ultimately the decision was taken to encamp at Mascana. There is water at Mascana, but again, not enough to re-water an entire army. And so during the night, Saladin realised that the Frankish army was in a serious situation, particularly through its lack of water, and so naturally he sought to exacerbate this, setting fire to the ground upwind of the Jerusalemite army so that the smoke would roll into its encampments, parching the throats of his opponents. So then the following day, again, King Guy's army tried to resume its march towards Tiberius. It didn't actually have that far to go, and it started that advance, but encountered very, very heavy resistance, this time not on the rear guard, but on the vanguard, as Saladin moved to block the Franks' line of advance. And there was very heavy fighting for a very long time, but ultimately King Guy was forced to withdraw to an old Iron Age fort called the Horns of Hattin. Now there's no water on the Horns of Hattin, but it is a defensible location. And so in the afternoon of the 4th of July, the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army took refuge on the Horns of Hattin, and Saladin launched attack after attack up the slopes of the Horns of Hattin. King Guy, for his part, tried to stage countercharges down the sides of this Iron Age fort. On one occasion, his knights specifically tried to target Saladin, the thinking being that if they could reach Saladin and kill him individually, his army might then dissipate. However, Saladin had practiced this kind of tactic before with his uncle, Shirkuh, in Egypt, and so when the knights charged down the slopes of the Iron Age fort, Saladin simply parted his army's ranks, the knights charged through the gap, and then he closed in upon them. Following this, dehydrated and demoralised, the army then ultimately surrendered, and this then marks the end of the Battle of Hattin. So why was the battle so important? What made it so important is that to raise an army big enough to face Saladin, what King Guy had done is to strip out garrisons from castles across the Kingdom of Jerusalem and to put together the biggest army possible. Now he needed to do that to face Saladin, but this created the problem that he had no second army. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army wasn't just defeated at Hattin, it was annihilated. The army either being killed or led off into captivity. So there's no second line of defence. The Kingdom of Jerusalem stands wide open in the wake of Hattin to Saladin's forces. And so Saladin then swept into the northern kingdom of Jerusalem, conquering city after city, ultimately conquering Jerusalem itself a few months later. Subsequently, Saladin staged campaigns to the north into the other Crusader States, the county of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch, and again Town after town, stronghold after stronghold fell to his advancing forces, and so 2 years later, after a period of intensive conquest, only the city of Tyre remained in the hands of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Every other town or city had fallen to Saladin's forces. So this really is a game-changing moment in the history of the Crusades, an enormous victory for Saladin, an enormous defeat for the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and this is the event that would then bring about the Third Crusade, led by leaders such as Philip II of France, Frederick I of Germany, Richard I of England, who would then stage a series of wars in later years, trying, ultimately failing, to regain control over Jerusalem. So Hattin is significant, but the question remains: how did the battle come about? Why was Saladin able to win such a substantial victory? Why was Guy defeated? Now, the traditional answer to this is that Guy was a fool, and that Guy made a series of very, very poor decisions which led ultimately to the battle's outcome. Crucially, his decision to march across a largely waterless zone at the height of summer is seen as being crucial in bringing about the army's defeat. And you can see the logic of that. Armies require huge amounts of water, and horses in particular require a great deal of water if they're going to remain in fighting condition. So maybe that's it. Maybe King Guy's decision in the first instance to march out from the relatively safe location of Saphuria and to try and relieve Tiberius, maybe that was his big failing. Maybe he should have taken the advice of Count Raymond III of Tripoli and stayed in Saphuria, or perhaps fortified himself in the nearby city of Acre. And certainly historians have pointed out that when Raymond gave this advice, he was actually giving advice that ran against his own interests, because Tiberius was his town and his wife was besieged in the city's citadel. And so you could see him as giving disinterested advice to a king who simply would not accept his counsel, and then led the army to a catastrophic defeat. That is perhaps the traditional argument, and certainly if you watch, a film like The Kingdom of Heaven, and you see the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army marching rather improbably through an area of desert. This is actually an area of sort of grassland and hill country, and suffering from dehydration, which ultimately led to the army's collapse. But is that actually a helpful interpretation of the battle? Should we see the battle very much as being Guy's defeat, brought about by Guy's own faulty decision-making? Well, this is a complicated question. I, in fact, have a rather different view on the Battle of Hattin. And there's a few points I'd like to raise here. The first is that, indeed, as several historians have pointed out, the accounts we have of the council that was held on the eve of the Battle of Hattin, that crucial event on the 2nd of July when the various leaders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem assembled to work out what they would do next, that account very much comes from a source produced by an author friendly to Raymond III of Tripoli, King Guy's opponent. And so that always leads me to wonder, are we actually seeing a clear account of events here, or are we just simply looking at an account of the events that was produced after the battle in order to exonerate Raymond III of Tripoli and to blame King Guy? I also wonder if King Guy's decision to march out on Tiberius, although we know it led to catastrophe, but we know that with the benefit of hindsight, was that decision on that day, on the 2nd of July, actually such a bad choice, given that they didn't know what the future held? And a key point for me here is that when the army advanced out from Saphuria, it marched out in a fighting march formation. Now, this is a distinctive formation that was used extensively in the Crusader States, and my key point is that this formation nearly always worked. For decades, the Crusader States had been assembling their armies in just such a formation and then marching either against an opposing army or to try and reach a specific target, all the while being attacked. And my key point is that this formation nearly always worked. In fact, I can only think of one occasion in the history of the Crusader States when a fighting march was actually broken, and that took place in the county of Edessa in 1146, and that was a fairly poorly formed fighting march, and it only collapsed when the fighting march itself broke its own ranks in order to stage a cavalry charge. In many other conditions, these fighting marches nearly always reached their target, even if they were opposed by a substantial field army. And part of the reason for this lies in the balance of warfare in the Near East at this time. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Crusader States, their great strength is in hand-to-hand combat. They have these very heavily armoured knights, very heavily armoured infantry whose specialism is at close quarters, and the knights in particular are mounted on big war horses who are capable of delivering a very heavy cavalry charge, which was nearly always irresistible provided it reached a target. And so hand-to-hand combat is the specialism of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So if they want to follow a particular road or a particular course, they can nearly always do it because the various armies of their opponents, their specialism was not hand-to-hand combat, so they couldn't physically block the road of an army from the Crusader States. The armies of Saladin and the other leaders of this era, their specialism is light cavalry. And so their tactics depend very much on wearing an opponent down with wave after wave of light cavalry archers, shooting volleys of arrows at opponents and just doing that percussively over and over again until an enemy army either stopped or broke. That's the strategy. And it was very difficult using light cavalry to block the advance of a heavily armoured army from the Crusader States specialised in hand-to-hand combat. And so we have examples. For example, in 1147, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem marched out from across the borders of the kingdom just to the south of Lake Tiberius and advanced on the town of Bosra, a very wide distance, and managed to get all the way to Bosra and all the way back, despite moving through very wide areas with very little water and under sustained attack. So we know that it's achievable for a fighting march to cover great distances, often distances a great deal longer than they had to cover at the Battle of Hattin, even if that area doesn't have much water. And certainly a few years earlier, in 1183, King Guy himself conducted fighting marches whilst shadowing one of Saladin's armies, and again moved through a waterless zone. So he does understand these things, and he does know that a fighting march nearly always reaches its target. And you could say, well, he's still marching in the July heat. True, he was. But he knows this. The Kingdom of Jerusalem has been fighting wars in this region for almost 9 decades by this stage, and the area around Tiberius has been part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem right from its origins. They know the territory well. It's not through a lack of familiarity that the army marched into that area. And so my contention would be that actually Guy had very plausible reasons for thinking that his army would be able to advance on Tiberius and reach its goal in one day, despite the distance, despite the opposition of Saladin's army. For me at least, the roots of the Battle of Hattin lie in Saladin's army rather than in Guy's army, because Saladin's an extremely capable commander. In fact, I've often thought that some historians don't give Saladin enough credit for his competence as a field commander. Saladin knew that the Kingdom of Jerusalem's great strength was in its mounted knights and its heavily armoured infantry, and he knew that in previous decades and in hand-to-hand combat, those knights and infantry had been virtually unstoppable in hand-to-hand combat. In the past, other rulers had generally only been able to defeat the Kingdom of Jerusalem or the other Crusader states by using endless wearing-down attacks conducted by light cavalry. He knew this. And so increasingly, from about the 1170s onwards, we begin to hear reports of Saladin building up his own heavy cavalry. And these forces initially don't seem to have been particularly numerous, but for me at least, the crucial moment in the Battle of Hattin is on the second day, when the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army resumed its march to Tiberius. How was Saladin able to block that advance? Because normally that wouldn't be possible, because physically blocking the road to an army from the Crusader States just wouldn't be achievable given the nature of the tactics practiced by all the various sides in this area. So how was Saladin able to block the army's line of advance? And my suspicion is that Saladin had substantially built up the numbers of his heavily armoured cavalry, his heavily armoured infantry, and so on this occasion he could block the Kingdom of Jerusalem's advance, and he could create a physical barrier along their line of approach and prevent them from reaching their target. So what we're seeing here in many ways is not so much Guy's defeat per se as Saladin's victory. He's worked out how to break a Frankish fighting march by deploying large numbers of heavily armoured infantry and cavalry, which I don't doubt he spent many years building up. And here he uses them to devastating effect, forcing the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army to leave its road to Tiberius and take refuge in the horns of Hattin, where subsequently it would be defeated. So my take on all of this hinges on a series of different points. Actually, I don't see Guy's decision to march out on Tiberius as being an especially implausible choice, at least considering the received wisdom of previous decades in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They knew their fighting marches always got through, and indeed for King Guy himself it would have been ruinous not to march to the aid of one of his frontier castles. It would be taken as a sign of weakness for him as king. Guy then advanced out in a fighting march formation, not unreasonably thinking that in that formation it wouldn't be possible to bar his road. Saladin slowed him down, he reached Mascana, but then Saladin deployed these heavily armoured forces who were then able to block the Kingdom of Jerusalem's advance the following day, and that's the crucial moment when Saladin was able to defeat the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army. From that point, it was just really a question of time before the army collapsed entirely and Saladin's forces could claim their victory. So for me, I see the Battle of Hattin as being much more about Saladin's victory, Saladin working out how he can unlock the weaknesses of the Frankish army and score one of the most significant battles in the medieval era in the Near East. Okay, so I do hope that you found this talk interesting. Please do look at the other talks in this collection.